primary purposes of this event is to gather various actors from different industries, NGOs, the private sector, to come together to come up with actionable solutions to some of the problems that we've identified. This is not a document that simply gets left on the table. We now take this and we work very hard, almost in an activist capacity, to make sure these recommendations get heard. We've recently had success with agriculture, food and agriculture in Asia, taking very specific recommendations from a forum like this and making sure that government ministers take that into their thinking with regards to the formulation of policy. So I won't speak much more. What we will do, we had 4 hours, or a total of 12 hours yesterday, of fairly robust discussion and debate. So I'll hand over to the chairs, and thank the chairs, by the way, for your efforts in terms of moderating those working groups. We've got approximately 10 to 15 minutes each, and I know it's a very short amount of time to report back on 4 hours. So we'll take about that amount of time. Then we'll leave a couple of moments for questions at the end, and we'll wrap up and conclude the summit. So we're going to start in order with the building and infrastructure. So Kees, if I could hand over to you to give a fairly concise summary of the output from that.
Thanks very much. Raising expectations there.
No, that's what we do.
It was a great session. To be honest, I was a bit scared when we started, with 4 hours in front of us, with a huge task to come up with transformative recommendations. A white sheet of paper, basically, with respect to how we should self-organize there, and 50 people that hardly knew each other before. But we had a great session. I enjoyed it a lot. It was a very energetic session, and it has become for me a very valuable part of the conference. We worked along the lines of the model proposed by Patty Fong in our group, and we split the task into four, thinking about demand, about financing, about regulation, and about political will. The logic being that in the end we need real demand for our solutions. We're not just going to force all of this down the throat of society. If we're talking about like 1.5 trillion worth of investments per year, that needs to be supported by real demand and a lot of financing, obviously. So the role of regulation is basically to facilitate that, to set the incentives, and maybe even more important, remove barriers or remove disincentives. And finally, to get the right regulations in place in the right time, you need that political will to drive the regulation. So what we actually did is split up in four groups and work on those four elements, but keenly watching the interaction with the other three sides of the square. And that worked out quite well, because we saw recommendations coming on the demand side, feeding into the regulatory side, but very much compatible with what came out of the regulatory group. So that's, in the end, I decided at night in the hotel it was a fairly consistent set of recommendations. And it felt like that, but getting the input from all the groups and having a second look provides a storyline, I think. So starting at the demand side, we came up with recommendations of consistent messaging, strong communication of co-benefits to users, not just focus on that energy efficiency. It's been addressed by a lot of the speakers here. Public building renovation programs, because we really think it's important for governments to set the example, to be launching customers for new solutions. Communicating within communities to share data and to also inspire sort of competition. Who does best, who is most energy productive in sectors or in neighborhoods. And for the supply side, coming up with integrated one-stop solutions. Take away the hassle of having to be your own general contractor when you want to redo your home in an energy productive way. On the financing side, recommendations for policymakers, the finance industry, and the energy efficiency industry itself. Touching on regulation, it's important for financing that those are strictly enforced, that they are reliable, that financing institutions know that this is going to be there for a while, and that it's real. Standard investment processes, such as those developed by the Investor Confidence Project. Energy efficiency providers to improve their understanding of the finance market. Very important that it comes from both sides. Looking for touch points, points of intervention, natural moments where investments can take place. Implementing fiscal stimulants. Monitoring and supporting the upcoming development of crowdfunding and the role it can play in driving forward financing of energy productivity. Supporting the energy efficiency investor statement, so supporting the initiative by financial institutions to get more active in this field. And as a very specific example, consider the energy spend, so the energy bill that was also addressed by the previous speaker, as part of affordability criteria for mortgage lending. So really building a bridge there between what you do on the energy bill and how your home gets financed. Then moving on to the regulatory side, some innovative solutions coming out of the group there. Mandatory requirement to renovate a building within a certain period, say 5 years after buying. It's being experimented with in some countries. It's the natural moment that people start redoing the house anyway, so why not plug in some kind of a requirement there, of course with exceptions in cases that doesn't make sense. Using energy performance certificates in a more appealing manner, for example linking support schemes to those certificates and not just showing them. And finally, very important, government should invest in qualification and training of planners, installers, etc., the capacity building that we need to actually implement this whole realization of energy productivity at a large scale in buildings and urban infrastructure. Then finally, the political will. Talked about a lot, and we started in the group by concluding that political will is not a useful concept. It sounds like yes or no, and everybody will say yes, of course, yes, energy efficiency, extremely important, yes, yes, we have the political will to do it. But as we see, not enough happens, so there's something in between. So what we thought was a more operational problem to address is political momentum. So is stuff actually happening from this theoretical yes to the actual implementation or driving forward of policies by politicians? And that is, for example, actually you can recognize three elements there. There's an element of understanding how this general yes can relate to specific policies, and that has to be furthered by a clear explanation also from our side. Secondly, the ability to design effective policies, and that could be furthered by providing overviews of best practices from around the world, from elsewhere. It's not the first time that someone is addressing this question, so how can we learn from experience elsewhere? And the third aspect is recognition of the efforts made to create real enthusiasm with politicians. Because if they're not enthusiastic, they'll leave it to civil servants and they'll have their little quarrels and some stuff will happen, but not at the required speed. So we need to catch the enthusiasm of politicians. And we've talked a lot about how to do that, and we came up with the formula of thinking about political co-benefits. So put ourselves in the shoes of the politician, the relevant politician in that specific city or country, and think what the political co-benefits are for him or her. And to give you some examples, if you see in the Netherlands, we have a lot of earthquakes around our conventional gas field, and that's becoming a major political headache. It leads to reducing the gas extraction from that field. Energy efficiency can be a tool for our politicians to do that in a painless way and to have some co-benefits seen from their side. They have to reduce, but how can we avoid that? It means that we stop our exports of natural gas, for example. Well, by energy efficiency. But in a city in India, it could be totally different. They're struggling with keeping up in energy infrastructure with the fast-growing demand of energy services. It leads to friction, it leads to blackouts, brownouts. So energy efficiency can help there. It can help keeping in sync. So that was actually pretty inspiring thinking, and I think we can take that a lot further in the coming weeks, months, and year. And,
it's an incredibly broad topic. So good summary. Look, let's move straight on to transportation, which is also a broad topic. So,
absolutely,
Sheila,
and I think that was probably one of our challenges, and that was something that came up really early on, the need to stay focused. So we were a little smaller, very informal group, which was great. We were lucky to have an excellent introductory overview presented to us by Heather Allen from SLOCAT, which is the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Partnership, which focused probably, told us a lot about the political context, of which there is a great deal, as we're hearing here, and focused on the avoid, shift, improve, and latterly added to that framework, enable framework of consideration. We had to remember that our focus was energy and not the many myriad different ways in which our global transportation, mobility, logistics system needs to be reformulated. We had 3 messages to consider, 3 draft messages, essentially around efficiency, awareness, and policy. And what was really interesting is they were rejected wholesale at the outset and then effectively rewritten. But what was great about that was they were also then owned by the group, I think, and the group had reached those conclusions, refining those messages to be more specific to the sorts of things that came up. There were 2 groups. Each group was set the task of looking at the 3 messages, so we didn't follow a model of dividing up by theme. They were mixed groups. There was some concern raised by one of our private sector colleagues that he was like a lamb to the slaughter in a world full of vicious NGO types, which I thought was rather sweet, actually, because in the NGOs, we tend to think it's the other way around. So we had a showing of hands, and we worked out that we were much more balanced than perhaps he'd thought, and the groups were very mixed. So the groups considered lots of different things. To give you a flavour, there were debates about carbon pricing. One group rejected it, one group thought it the best thing to proceed with. A heated debate around the concept of picking technological winners. So within transport, as with so many of these issues around energy productivity, we're bedeviled by the concept of the silver bullet. So don't worry about efficiency in existing internal combustion engines, which is not doing very well, but that's my own personal gripe. Let's all say that EVs are coming and it'll all be fine, or let's all say hydrogen or whatever. Big concern that we shouldn't be seen, therefore, to be putting these messages in the context of a technology which may yet be no longer flavour of the month, even in a matter of months. Finance, we had some great contributions around the issue of the need for better small finance. Regulation as a spur, very, very interesting across both groups. Strong feeling that regulation was an opportunity far more than a threat, which I think is an interesting take. Great deal of conversation about the need to connect, to communicate, to balance positive and not negative. That was a word no one wanted to use, but perhaps more, sense of imperative and the need for action, that sort of messaging, the need to connect with young people. We were blessed to have some young people in our room. They thoroughly exposed us oldies who basically looked at them as I do at my teenage sons and kind of vaguely tried to keep up with some of the words and acronyms, but they were terribly helpful in saying, how do you make this message current? How do you make sure people engage? It's very much what we were just hearing from Form for the Future in terms of the household perspective. Technologies, are we there, aren't we there? If you were a battery boy, yeah, you were there, batteries are sorted. If you're not, then clearly we are not. An important focus, looking outside the OECD, We're all very good at talking about the UK, even more focused perhaps on the OECD, but what we need to bear in mind is a lot of these challenges are at their most pointed outside of those countries, and we had to kind of run our ideas through that prism as well. So that was the kind of conversation. We came up with 3 main conclusions and 3 main messages. 1, we have to have collaboration and partnership, and we need a dialogue to ensure that our transition to low-carbon mobility and logistics is integrated, cost-efficient, and that the messaging is, as I say, balanced. And that has to be across consumers, government, civic society, and business. Everybody inside the tent, big tent. High potential, that's the second message, for improved efficiency from avoid, shift, improve. And I won't go into the detail of that, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Don't do it, do it better, shift to alternate modes. And that efficiency potential out of vehicles and engines is there, but it's about more than that, and at the heart of it, stringent targets and standards. And then finally, that this shift to clean and low carbon energy within this sector has to be incentivized and enabled. And that's innovation, appropriate financing, it's either too small or too big, properly reflecting true environmental costs, carbon pricing, and properly pricing in environmental costs in the mobility and logistics model. And we had some excellent contributions from people in various sectors who said it was cheaper for them to ship prawns for peeling from Scotland to China and back again, or raw materials for plastic products from the US to China to have them made up into product, which was clearly environmentally costly, but nowhere did anyone charge them for that. So that's the synopsis. I hope that is sufficient in terms of...
I mean, that really is. And interesting to raise the point on the young people as well. I'm based in New York City, and they're currently arranging a march of 1 million people, and that's when we really start to get the political elites to sit up and listen. When we get these movements, and the Avars platform that we've mentioned yesterday are starting to get great traction. So it's good to have young people in, because they look at things fairly simplistic, which they are. Okay, let's round off with Dan, who you've heard from already over the course of the last 2 days, and to give a summary on the manufacturing situation and some recommendations. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Tony. So we also had a great discussion and a varied group. We did a show of hands at the beginning to see who was in the room, and we had a mixture of businesses and NGOs, academia and government. We had the working title of How Can Manufacturing Transform Energy Productivity, but noted at the outset that actually we could reverse that and say, how could energy productivity transform manufacturing, which would be equally as interesting a discussion. We had a pretty organic approach to our groups. We split into 3 groups, and we used the recommendations that were in the working paper as a straw man that could stimulate debate, but wasn't meant in any way to constrain the discussion. The recommendations going in were, 1, to understand the materiality of energy within a business and relative to others. 2, to have a better handle on information. And 3, to really think on a systems level. The materiality recommendation disappeared. The second and third on information and systems were refined and got in the final mix. For the recommendations, one of the things I stated at the outset was that, yes, we want to be thinking about policy recommendations, and they can be at the national or the subnational level, but we can't just throw all of our problems at policymakers. It's easy for us to sit here in a conference and say, yeah, I know what the government should do. The government should just do this, and it'll all be fine. It's much harder than that. So we forced ourselves to look at ourselves and think, and what are the actions that could apply to a range of organizations, including those organizations that are in the room. And actually, we made a decision to specifically name who we thought the recommendation was for. So rather than throwing it out there into the ether, we actually challenged ourselves. Well, who do we actually think is going to do that? What we're saying, who is going to do it? So that was a little test for us. And what did we come up with? Well, we came up with a list of 12 at the beginning, a longer list. We found some synergies and a little bit of duplication, which allowed us to shortlist. We then debated a couple of the options. We had 2 brave volunteers go into a little mini duel, and then we voted on that in order to arrive at a top list of 5, which were then wordsmithed overnight. So they haven't been checked back with the group, and therefore, if If these aren't quite right, then when we get the chance to have questions from the audience, they can put their hand up and help to refine them. So what do we end up with? We ended up with 5. Number 1, to standardize energy productivity data and measurement, including product footprinting. And we thought that was the kind of thing that a standards body could do. We could build on ISO 5001. We could build on the work of the Carbon Trust, who've got the PAS 2050 on product footprinting. So they were the 2 organizations we thought might do something about that. Now, this issue of information and standardization came up a lot because it's actually very hard to benchmark between businesses or between households, between countries even. And the way we do that can be quite crude. And yet the evidence is suggesting that from a psychological perspective, and this was part of the discussion, understanding where you are relative to your peers actually can incentivize progress on energy efficiency. And we've seen some of the best examples of that at the household level where your neighbor's energy use is kind of anonymized, but it's the house next to you. I mean, it's not really anonymized, or a house very similar to you, and they're using a third or half the amount of energy, and that begs the question, well, why is my energy bill so high? So standardizing energy productivity data and measurement we thought was really useful. Number 2 was to create energy productivity learning networks for businesses to allow them to share best practices and collaborate on pilots. Pilots could be things like demand-side management or leasing of lighting, industrial symbiosis, some of these more innovative things that are coming through. That was based on success in Germany. There have been a number of energy efficiency learning networks set up there, and we didn't see any reason why that model couldn't apply in other regions. Who did we think would actually be interested in this? We thought local chambers of commerce might support the creation of local learning energy productivity networks. Energy service companies may be incentivized to organize businesses in such a way. And the experience in Germany actually was catalyzed with a government policy on energy efficiency learning networks. So there were some pilots, and then the pilots then were kind of taken up by a variety of other organizations. Recommendation number 3 was to map business energy usage, especially what's happening with heat, in industrial parks and in cities, and to use the findings of that mapping and examples of successful industrial symbiosis in order to identify energy productivity opportunities and to drive action. So this was really about industrial symbiosis and thinking on a systems level and understanding that inputs and outputs from one business can relate or be helpful to inputs and outputs to another business, and that there's a potential energy productivity gain there. And we thought, who would be interested in that? We thought that's the kind of thing a think tank might do, but very useful to be doing that in collaboration, let's say, with a municipality. So municipality will have a role in overseeing local businesses and or a local business park, and therefore might be a useful kind of government partner. Recommendation number 4, we talked a lot about the importance of targets and how a number of the multinationals have set energy efficiency targets, which is great, and we've seen some leadership there, but often the targets don't cascade down the supply chain. So recommendation number 4 was to cascade energy productivity targets down the supply chain to report and verify them, which we thought was absolutely critical. Otherwise, anything could be reported, really, and there are some challenges around the data, particularly in some of the emerging economies where the systems are not in place and the history of the data is not available. Who do we think should do that? Well, businesses essentially have to be asking their suppliers to adopt an energy productivity target and to report on it. CDP, of course, is very active in this space and could play a useful role as the reporting authority and or the verifier of the information. And the 5th and final recommendation was to use shadow carbon pricing internally in businesses in decision-making, which we saw as a macro-level driver, which would result in more energy productivity actions being undertaken because they tend to make more economic sense. But we needed something, we talked about the need for internal drivers of change, and that a shadow carbon price could do that. And I think Brian made a very interesting comment, which is businesses that aren't using any kind of shadow carbon price are essentially assuming that it's zero. And although we don't know what the carbon price should be, what we do know is that it's not zero. And so there's really no excuse for any business that's taking this seriously not to be using an internal shadow carbon price. And a number already are, and it'll be great to see other businesses follow their lead. So that was an action for businesses to take up for sure, but we also thought that there needed to be some kind of economic or business driver that would make this more of a priority. And so organizations like the World Economic Forum or the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, UNEP-FI, some of these similar bodies, they could make the case. They could help to encourage the use of internal shadow carbon pricing. That was us.
Thank you indeed. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes to go. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in here. It's a fairly general one, so I may keep this one for the conclusion and do it the old-fashioned way. If we could go back to the audience, it's always nice to sort of look at the person that's asking the question, because we've had Donald Trump that's actually appeared through Pigeonhole. I don't think it is actually Donald Trump, and I'm sure that he's not quite interested in what's going on here. But if we do have any questions directly from the audience, there's a couple of microphones that are going around now, Daya. If there are not, I will begin to wrap up and ask that one concluding question to each of the panellists. So I think we've had pretty good Q&A, haven't we, for a day and a half. The question I've got in from the Pigeonhole is that to each of you, and we'll start with Kees, if there is one message that you could give to the G20 and the COP21 process around energy productivity, what would that one message be? If there was one message that you could give to the G20 organisation and insert directly into the COP21 process, what would that message be? Kees, sorry to put you on the spot.
That's a good one. I'd highlight those political co-benefits, I think, in a generalized way, because we can't go into Groningen gas fields or Mumbai energy infrastructure challenges. But I'd make a strong statement for the political co-benefits. It's not directly going to be used in the COP, but it can surely help coming to productive conclusions on the climate side.
I think that's reasonable. Yeah. Sheila?
Well, it's quite an easy question, actually. Now, I'm not Donald Trump, but this is the message I give them. It's the message we are giving them at the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, which is you need to say that improved fuel economy in vehicles is not going well enough, it should be going better, that existing cost-effective technologies, so we don't need new technologies on this little bit, could save us $2 trillion net by 2025. That's 5 times as much as the IEA say we need to invest in EVs. So it could save us that money. By 2050, it can save us 2 gigatons. The technology's here. The cars are being driven in some parts of the world. They're not in the rest. So for my little bit, I'd say get that into your... And we are doing that. We're on the Energy Efficiency Task Group working with the G20, and we're working in the COP, but it's not moving fast enough, and we need more people to join that message.
Thank you, Sheila. It's not a little bit, that's actually a big bit.
It's a big bit. It's a really big bit, but it's only part of the message. I understand that.
And Dan, what would you tell them?
I would say that every time decisions are being made to increase power supply, that energy efficiency has to be considered as the first option before thinking about increasing supply. And that applies in, say, the capacity markets, where you've got to allow energy efficiency service companies and similar businesses to be able to bid in to compete with bids that come from providers of other forms of fuel. So efficiency absolutely has to be that first fuel, and that applies in both developed and developing countries, and it also links through to the opportunities in demand-side management, where when there are peaks and troughs in energy demand, and often when there are peaks, we're drawing down on some of the dirtiest forms of fuel. We need to stop that from happening as well. We need to then be immediately jumping to energy efficiency as the way of plugging that gap rather than drawing down. So it's about new capacity, and it's about how we draw down on existing capacity. And if we can mainstream that through operations and policies, at the national and the subnational level and businesses, then we'll really start to realize the energy productivity opportunity.
Thank you, Dan. We do have one question, Daya, at the front from the Chief Executive Officer of Ecofys. if we could get the microphone, and I think that will be a good note to finish off on.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe it's a bridge to your closing statement. Reflecting here for about a day and a half and listening to through the very interesting feedback from the panel. The key question I have is, how can this be continued? We have a lot of expertise in the room. We come from different backgrounds, be it industry, be it government, be it an NGO, be it a consultant, whatever. But collectively, we bring a lot of knowledge and experience to the table. And I experienced that very much in the session on buildings when we discussed financing options and all the issues associated with that. And listening to the three of you, I know all of you and all of you are very much involved with the necessary works, but I have one key question. How can we make 1 + 1 is 10? How can we really connect following the summit and continue with the good discussion we have? Maybe you can have a response to that, but that is something I feel strongly about. Thanks.
Absolutely. Any response to that, or I could certainly make some comments in my closing. Yeah, Sheila.
I would respond by saying we've outlined that we need, covering my mic, we need $12 million total to do a global program of awareness raising and capacity building in all countries on fuel economy. Existing policy, and absolutely about countries choosing what works for them. That is nothing. That is so tiny, it's embarrassingly nothing. It's probably what companies in this room spend on corporate hospitality. So it's about putting your money where your mouth is across all the sectors. We're a charity, we're putting $1 million in. We're putting our money where our mouth is, and I think we need more of that. On my bit.
Thank you. And just a quick word on that. There's a question that's come in that said, can global initiatives provide an online social tool platform to keep the dialogue going? And the answer is yes. We'll be announcing something in November at the Singapore event. The Singapore Responsible Business Forum is our largest event. We have 1,000 people there, and it's government-led. So we have ministers from all around the region. At that point, we'll make some announcements. And I think it's important because we all live in different countries that we can use technology that's available today to keep this dialogue going. And as I said, it doesn't hurt for us, even from the private sector, to become activists because it's such a critical discussion that we need to keep going. So Dan, you've got a final thing to add, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, an attempt at a response to a very good question. My answer would be that I think we need to unite around common goals, and certainly for us at the ClimateWorks Foundation and working with the Alliance to Save Energy, we've united around the goal of doubling energy productivity by 2030. And it's not to say that's the final word, because the challenge with efficiency is that it never ends. It's not like you get to 100% renewable. You probably never get to 100% energy efficiency, but we have to. We can't let the best be the enemy of the good, and this is a target that's been derived from a fair bit of research, and we think that can apply at the national level, we think that can apply at the sub-national level, we think we can engage corporates on this target, we think we can use it to stimulate investor pressure to drive more funds into energy productivity. So I would say uniting around a common goal, and for us that's doubling energy productivity by 2030.
Okay, please thank Dan, Sheila and Kees. Thank you.